Hello, I'm Joseph Scott Morgan. I'm an associate professor of applied forensics and the distinguished scholar of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about an office that not very many people are familiar with, or maybe you're familiar with it from watching television and those sorts of things. I got to tell you, when I first got involved in the field many years ago, I really had no idea as to what the coroner's office did, but today we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to give you an idea as to exactly how old this office is, and in addition to that, how it impacts our lives today, particularly in the world of forensics and death investigation. Now, when we think about the office of coroner, and just the word itself, it's an odd word. I think that when I first heard it, I automatically, my default position was to think that coroner, it probably has something to do with heart, maybe coronary arteries, and that's not the case at all. So we'll get right to this, and I'll kind of explain it to you because it is, in and of itself, a bit of a mystery from a at least historic standpoint. The first player to kind of enter the stage when it comes to any discussion about coroners is Richard I of England, commonly known as Richard the Lionhearted. An interesting fact about Richard is that Richard was not what you think of when you think of a typical king. He, particularly as it applies to Great Britain, of course, specifically England. Interestingly enough, it's stated that Richard could barely even understand English. He may have only visited the country at most 3 times throughout his entire reign. He busied himself in the pursuit of conducting crusades. And so he was constantly going to the Holy Land. He was constantly being captured, it would seem. And of course, he had to be ransomed. And this happened on a regular basis. Reflectively, when you think about his life and kind of how he would fund these campaigns to go and fight in the Holy Land as a crusader, as you can imagine, it was very costly, and he wasn't deriving very much tax income from Great Britain or from England itself. Where he was getting his money, though, a little bit that he had was actually being stifled. And if you think back to the tales of Robin Hood and evil King John, and of course the biggest villain of all, the Sheriff of Nottingham, sheriffs were actually tax collectors. And so, if you will, the faucet was kind of being cut off on his cash flow, and he had to come up with another idea. And this led him to establish an office that was actually referred to as the coroner. And this is where we get the term coroner. And many years ago, during the Middle Ages itself, this is when the term was actually coined. And over a period of time, coroner turned into coroner. And this is actually where we can trace the roots of the so-called death tax that many people talk about a lot now, but this is what it derives from. Now, here's how this kind of worked back then. He had to come up with a way to avoid the sheriffs and the income that they were taxing from all of the peoples of the kingdom, and come up with a different way, a different plan to literally bleed more money out of the country. And this is where this idea of a death tax arises from. In 1194, there was a document that was created, a judicial document, that was actually called the Articles of Eyre. And Eyre itself roughly translates into a circuit jurisdiction. And what Richard did was essentially appoint 3 knights. They would ride a circuit, the Eyre, and they would go from little village to little hamlet to small little town and take a look at what properties there were there and who had passed away. Now, this is kind of interesting because if you died, your family was taxed, but it gets even worse than that. Not only were you taxed, but if you were murdered, the murderer, his family, would be heavily taxed. And if you committed suicide, well, it was bad for the family that left behind, because what would happen is that all of your property would be forfeited to the Crown. The family members that were left around would soon be put into virtual servitude, and so if the crowner, if the actual knights that were making the circuit could prove that a death was a suicide, it automatically became more valuable to the Crown because they could justify the seizure of all of the properties. Here we have an image of myself and my son outside of the Houses of Parliament in Great Britain, and there's the famous statue of Richard the Lionhearted in the background there. So as we come to America and time evolves, the office of coroner really didn't evolve along with this. And I'm talking about this from a scientific perspective now. You still had people that were validating death to say, yes, in fact, this individual did die. They would put together what were referred to as coroner juries to look into the deaths. But, in all fairness to them, scientific knowledge was at a premium back then. But they did, in fact, come together to form juries that would try to come to the most logical conclusion that they could in order to rule on a death. And that's actually still a job that coroners do day after day after day. Even now, they validate deaths. And if you think about coroners, they are the validators of death. Not only do they pronounce death in many jurisdictions, but they give us an idea as to what brought about death. And this, along with the rest of English common law, traveled with the first settlers to colonial America. So, as time had gone by in the United States and our scientific knowledge in a very broad terms had begun to expand, and our understanding of the natural world and kind of the mechanisms around death and disease and that sort of thing, people began to question some of the motives behind rulings that coroners would make, and if they were actually solid from a scientific perspective. And so in the early 1800s, really the only thing that we had still to that date were coroners. And many times you would have physicians that would occupy that space. I myself started out as a practitioner, as a medical legal death investigator in a state, Louisiana, that in order to run for the office, you had to at least be a medical doctor. That's not the case in all other states. So it was hit or miss at best. But in 1877, we first hear the term medical examiner applied, and this was in the state or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And they still had a coroner, but the coroner there would bring in a medical expert, a medical examiner, to consult on a case and help the coroner come to a conclusion. Because in some of these jurisdictions, the coroner would be a local magistrate, for instance, that didn't really have an understanding of medicine or disease or trauma. Then we jump forward to 1915, and both the city of New York as well as Cleveland almost simultaneously established an office of medical examiner in both of those towns. And these are the very first instances of an office of medical examiner, and it led, at least in those two specific towns, for those individuals to get rid of the office of coroner. Now, interestingly enough, still in the state of New York, they still have elected county coroners, okay? And still in Ohio, they have elected county coroners. But when you go to towns like Cleveland or New York, coroners are not there. So they made a constitutional decision at that point in time to eradicate the office, but specifically for those specific jurisdictions. Here we actually have a longhand report written out. This is a result of the coroner's jury determination in Clyde Barrow's death in northern Louisiana back in the 1930s. This is written in longhand, and this is a combination of all the gentlemen that impaneled the coroner's jury there, and of course they came to the conclusion that he had died as a result of multiple gunshot wounds. So where does it kind of stand now? Well, the CDC itself has put together a pretty fantastic website that kind of follows local and state coroner laws and also medical examiner laws. If you take a look at the map that we have before you, all of those states that are in gray still have a semblance of a coroner, but they might also have an amalgam of both coroner and medical examiner system. It all depends on what locale you go to. Whereas if you look at the blue states are purely coroner states. That means that the people that are specifically vested with the responsibility of conducting medical legal death investigations are elected officials in those states. All the rest are either state or regional medical examiners' offices. For example, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Utah, Maine, and you can look at the others and get an idea where the coroner no longer exists. I think probably one of the big questions that the public continues to ask day in and day out, particularly when they're faced with a death in their family, is the information coming into us satisfactory? And what I mean by that is when you have a loved one that dies, are you completely and totally reliant upon the information that is being filtered to you through the local medical legal authority, whether that be the medical examiner or it be an elected coroner? Can you actually trust what they're saying? Because let's face it, when you lose someone in your family or you lose a friend or a neighbor, you want sufficient information about their death. It can impact all manner of life, everything from public safety. Do we have a disease that's present? Do we have a killer on the streets? Maybe there's a genetic predisposition to disease in our family, and this needs to be explored, and we need to take a look at this from a genetic standpoint, and this, of course, is achieved through autopsy. Unfortunately, many coroners that are out there don't receive sufficient training from the states where they live. There's been some effort put forward in order to kind of bolster the training that they're getting, but when compared to other offices, particularly agencies like law enforcement agencies, the coroner's training greatly pales. We take a look at the images that we have here, and one case that really comes to mind over the past few years is the Golden State Killer. Here I am on a panel with actually 4 of the survivors of the Golden State Killer back in 2019, and they solved this case through familial DNA. Well, the reason this image is important and how it applies to coroners is that if you do not have a higher scientific understanding, that is through education and practice and that sort of thing, it's very difficult to grasp these complex constructs and what you need to do in order to process, say, biological evidence that's gathered at a scene, how to process the body and keep it safe, and glean everything you can in order to get killers like the Golden State Killer off of the streets. So the basic function of the office of coroner, for many that don't understand this, is first off, we have to determine specifically what the cause is. Is it some kind of heart-related problem? Is it a firearms-related death? Is it blunt force trauma that arose, say, for instance, from a motor vehicle crash or some other disease or horrible trauma that the individual had sustained? That's the specific cause. Then after a cause of death has been determined, the coroner has to, at that moment in time, pick from a group of five manners of death. How is this going to qualify? I mean, let's just think for just a second about, for instance, gunshot wounds. Well, if you think about gunshot wounds, how many different categories of the manners of death could a gunshot wound fit under? Well, we have accidental, we have suicide, we have homicide, okay? So we have those 3 categories basically that they can choose from, and the information that comes in from the scene, the information that they develop as a result of an investigation, they have to take all of this and compile it to make this ultimate decision. And as you can imagine, this impacts families greatly, and how they're going to live their lives moving forward. There's a completely different outcome for a family that, say, for instance, has a loved one, say a small child that dies as a result of an accidental a gunshot wound or even a homicide, as opposed to a suicide. And so these decisions are very, very impactful, and not to mention any kind of disease that's found. Say, for instance, your family has some kind of predisposition to a type of cancer in your family. That's something that you would want to know, because moving forward, if there are more children born into that family, you would want to know what kind of treatment plan, for instance, to come up with. So there's a lot resting on this. And of course, during these times of COVID, we have to think about epidemiology. We hear quite a bit about studies that are conducted on the living, but I would submit that studies of the dead are just as important to determine what the mortality is, what's involved, what was their sequencing relative to the manifestation of the disease, the treatment, how the patient responded, and this sort of thing before death. And then, of course, you have to go back at autopsy and examine the bodies. And then thirdly, that brings us to this idea of identification. And this is something that you can't just kind of slip by and make an assumption that everybody is going to be identified. You know, how many times have we looked on television, and there's a whole industry that's built up now in the true crime world where unidentified bodies are the center focus of these programs. And it's hard to imagine, but you know, right now there's roughly 50,000 unidentified people nationwide in our country that are actively unidentified. Their remains might just be skeletonized, or they might be buried in an unmarked grave. Does the local coroner have the ability and access to technology, say for instance like DNA, to examine these bodies, to extract the proper biological sample that can be tested, and then to get it to the right testing facility in order to pool this information and try to determine who this individual is? And of course, a subset of that, contrary to what you see on television, it's generally the coroner that's going to make a familial notification once an individual is in fact identified. So at the end of the day, this is kind of how we break this down. With coroners, coroners are by and large elected. Very rarely are coroners appointed unless, say for instance, a coroner may die in office or gets involved in some kind of malfeasance. You might have to have a chance for the governor, for instance, to step in and appoint a temporary coroner. But on a county-by-county basis, the coroners are elected. And they come from all walks of life. And please understand, these are public servants. These are individuals that want to go out and view the worst events that can possibly befell any of our citizenry. Horrible car accidents, children that have passed away, fires, homicides, and all these sorts of things. And they're looking for answers, but they might not be as trained up and skilled as, say, for instance, their counterparts in the medical examiner's offices. And let's keep in mind, medical examiners are actually appointed individuals. And by and large, they are physicians, and more specifically, they're forensic pathologists. So you go to a state, for instance, like I had mentioned in Utah or Oklahoma, where the whole state is nothing but a medical examiner state. Your chief medical legal death investigator for that state is going to be a board-certified forensic pathologist that's probably got 11 to 12 years postgraduate education, as opposed to a coroner who may have finished high school but never gone on to higher education, and then once elected has not received any further training or education. So it's an interesting time to be viewing the office of coroner in the world in which we exist, because many years ago we could say simply that, for instance, the coroners deal with dead people and that's what they do, and I don't want to know anything about it. But with modern media, the way things are, there are many people that sit at home day after day, watch true crime stories, they watch scientific programs on television, and they are becoming progressively more and more educated. It's time that we take the office of coroner and elevate it, bring it up to a level that can provide services to the public which they expect and do, in fact, deserve. Thank you for listening, and go Gamecocks.